People understood there were going to be fewer monasteries in this new church governed by the king, but they didn't understand that there were going to be no monasteries until the spring of 1540, when there were no monasteries. Young men are still coming forward to be ordained right the way through until as late as September 1539, only about 7 or 8 months from the final monasteries being shut down. The transformation of a culture and religious life in which men and women made different and distinctive contributions to one where we have a masculine experience. I think that absolutely has to be the worst consequence.
Hello everyone, welcome to the British History channel with me, Philippa Lacey, and to our latest historian interview. If you've been here before, thank you for coming back as always. And if this is your first time and you love British history, you're definitely in the right place, so stick around. Not only have I got a fantastic interview for you today, James Clark, I'm speaking to in a minute, absolutely incredible mind, and the information you're going to get today is golden. But I also have over 40, I think it's nearly 50. In fact, I think, James, today is my 50th historian interview on this channel. So you have all of those to go back and enjoy for the first time, or perhaps the second time or third time. The information in them is amazing. So you're in the right place anyway, is all you need to know. So today, as I say, I am talking to Professor James Clark. And James is a professor of history at the University of Exeter. He is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the Society of Antiquaries. Previously, he has taught at Bristol, Warwick, Oxford, and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, if I've pronounced that correctly. His research focuses on religious and cultural life from the Middle Ages to the Tudor Reformation. And his book on the dissolution of the monasteries, I mean, it's one that if you've been following me for a while, you'll know I bang on about, because don't let its size put you off, because it is a must read. I would say if you are into the Tudor period or the history of Christianity, the history of religion. In fact, what we'll go into today is this is not just about Henry VIII and what he was up to, or the church and how they reacted and what that was all about. This actually tells us a lot about Tudor life, all the way down to the lowest ranks of society, and just way more about what society and what England was actually about. So this book, The Dissolution of the Monasteries, it was published by Yale in 2021, and it was the first fresh study for more than half a century, and it was instantly acclaimed as a classic. I would agree. But James is a regular contributor to history programs on the TV and radio. He was a consultant on the popular BBC TV series Tudor Monastery Farm. And this is, in fact, James's second interview with me. We've actually worked on a number of different projects, but in terms of a YouTube and podcast interview, this is the second one. Our first interview was shared over 5 episodes, and I'll link to that in the show notes. In that, we tackled many misconceptions and misunderstandings around the dissolution. We talked about what Henry VIII's real intentions were for the monasteries, and that might surprise you. The fact that it actually wasn't known that it was going to be a full-scale dissolution until it was the case. We talked about what the Valor Ecclesiasticus actually was, how the pilgrimage of grace actually led to the closure of monasteries, clearly in direct contravention to its aim. And we also talked about what actually happened when a monastery closed. So I am so happy to be joined again by James. We think we don't know much about Tudor society beyond what royalty and the nobility were getting up to. Well, actually, James and James's work argue that actually we have been massively overlooking a rather famous resource which tells us even more than its more famous brother or sister, the Domesday Book, about the country. I've alluded to it already, the Valor Ecclesiasticus. It reveals huge amounts about women of all ranks, industries, charity work, the landscape, place names. It tells us so much, and it has been hiding in plain sight. James and his colleagues are doing their best to share with us what it tells us, and they're part of a project to make it accessible to the public. The Valor Ecclesiasticus was commissioned in 1535 by Henry VIII at the dawn of his supremacy over the church in England. If you think about it, and this is what James explained in our first set of interviews, Henry was the new CEO. He wanted to know what he had. So it's sort of this survey of what he was now overseeing. Looking back on history, of course, we know that by the end of 1540, all of the monastic houses and related institutions had been dissolved, either closed completely or transferred into religious houses of the new reformed regime. In this context, the Valor Ecclesiasticus has sort of been resigned to the survey which gave Henry those pound signs in front of his eyes. But it was not that. In fact, it was the largest survey of the country in both scope and size. So you've heard enough from me, because what we really want to do is hear James talk about this and tell us all about it. So James, welcome back to the British History Channel, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, said in the introduction, we're going to be talking about the Valor Ecclesiasticus and how it's such a well-known, very famous document, I would say. Mind you, maybe I'm saying that because I like Tudor history. Maybe other people are like, no. And yet it has been completely majority overlooked as to what information it actually contains. So tell us a bit of a background then about what the Valor Ecclesiasticus was when it was commissioned.
I think you're absolutely right. First of all, the name may well be familiar to anyone who has delved a bit into the history of Henry VIII's reign. You'll find it referenced with that Latin name, Valor Ecclesiasticus, in most general histories of the period. But it's known as a name rather than, I think, in many cases, for what it actually was. It's a survey. It's a national survey. Perhaps the best point of comparison, which will help people understand what it was, is to say that it's Henry VIII's Domesday Book. It's a survey of property, income, and people across his kingdom, across England and Wales. It's intended to capture a snapshot of the economy of the church in that Tudor kingdom. And it's initiated in the spring of 1535 as the very first step that Henry takes after he has declared himself supreme governor of the church in England. He makes that declaration at the end of 1534 under the Parliamentary Statute of Supremacy. This is famously when Henry effectively becomes head of the church and formalizes the break with the papacy in Rome. And his very next step, as you would expect, if you like, when somebody becomes chief executive of a very large and complex business, you want to understand the inner workings of that business. And above all, given your position at the head of it, you want to understand what it's worth. And that's what Henry's doing in this survey. He commissions a survey to understand what this extraordinary institution that has been in place in England and Wales in some or other form since England was converted to Christianity, what is it worth? How does it work? Who's involved? What is, if you like, the collateral of this institution? What property does it have? Where is it? How is it managed? Who is it managed by? Who is it involving? And what are its operations? What are the extent of its operations? Everything, as I say, that you would do if you were stepping up to take control of some large corporation, which is effectively what Henry's doing. I do think we have to understand it against the backdrop of that act at the end of 1534 makes him head of the church, because this is very much a first step. Too often, I think, this survey is understood retrospectively, well, he's doing this because we know what happens next. But Henry doesn't know what happens next. Of course, he only knows what has just happened. What has just happened is he's taken control. And in order to make good that control of the church that he's taken, he needs to understand its inner workings, its operation. What is this church machine? And that's what it's about. And of course, I think too often forget, because Henry VIII's reign is packed with innovations of one kind or another, new parliamentary statutes that are unprecedented, and closures of great institutions that are unprecedented, and so on. There's a lot of innovation, but essentially this is still a medieval system of government, and Tudor England is still a very provincial place. There isn't good communication from Westminster and from the seat of power across the country. And there really is no effective way to take that snapshot than to carry out as it were, door-to-door survey, a sort of census, to send people out to gather that information. Because for all of Henry's enormous ambition in governing England and Wales, nonetheless, he's working with essentially very medieval materials. So this foot-pounding survey is the only way to achieve it.
One of the points you make in your book, which I think is useful for people, or it's interesting and useful for people to think about, is not only with the communication networks were medieval, because also so were our road systems. And when you say there, he takes sort of head of the church in England by the end of 1534. The survey doesn't begin until the spring of 1535. Practically, they weren't going to be able to get out on the roads before that.
No, indeed. They have a pretty narrow window for activity of this kind. They really have to wait until the onset of spring and hopefully drier weather to get over this provincial land. And again, they're well aware that by the time that autumn comes, access to remoter places will be very constrained. And we know later in 1535, as the King's Commissioners are heading out on a visitation of all church institutions as well, in parallel with the valuation survey, that again, they avoid some institutions that they were expecting to visit simply because the roads are impassable. They can't get there. This is the reality. This is the lived experience of what is still very much a unchanged medieval system of government that depends on feet on the ground, people sent out on horseback from one end of the country to the other, and having to work with the elements. In fact, one of the reasons that what had been the practice in previous generations for the crown to take Parliament out into different provincial centres, sometimes Parliament in the later medieval period had met in places like Coventry and Gloucester, but people always complained that it's very difficult to get to these places, except in high summer. So you've got a government grounded, if you like, in the capital, London, Westminster, which is struggling to get a grip on remote, dispersed institutions across the country. And one of the stories not often enough told, I think, of what happens in this process of change and intervention in the church is how often Henry's regime is playing catch up, struggling to verify information that it simply cannot gather reliably. And the stop-start character of implementing policy is directly related to this very practical challenge, practical difficulty, that it's a difficult country to govern, just as much of the rest of Europe is. Perhaps the difference with the Tudor Kingdom of England and Wales is that it's not only very provincial, very subject to the challenges of the elements, it's also not a densely urbanized country. Towns, for the most part, are not super large. Even the largest cities are small by comparison with many mainland European cities, the northern Italian cities. Huge populations. The wealthy cities of the German Rhineland, again, huge populations. England and Wales has London, it has Norwich, it has York, it has Bristol, but they're small modest by comparison. So there's a mismatch between the ambition of the Henrician regime and the practicalities of the country that he is seeking to govern in this new centralized way. He wants to be, as we know, it's there in his statutes. He wants to be an imperial king, but the kingdom itself is not very well suited to that kind of imperial authority.
And what are the reactions and attitudes of the institutions that are being visited?
With the valuation survey, there is, for the most part, a response that is cooperative and exactly what we might expect. Valuation surveys of property in and of themselves were not unprecedented. And there had been moments earlier in England's medieval past where there had been attempts to carry out a complete valuation of church property and income during the late 13th century and into the 14th century. Successive papacies had wanted, as part of its process of levying tax on the English church, like it levied tax on other national churches across Western Christendom, was attempting to gather similar sorts of information. So these church institutions are not completely unfamiliar with needing to respond to a survey. There's nothing to suggest that they consider that there's something insidious or threatening about the King's Commissioners showing up, wanting to ask questions about what property is held, what are its values, what are its liabilities, how much income comes in annually. If there's any hesitation, it seems to be coming from some of those who are asked in different regions of the country to actually lend a hand in carrying out the survey. Some of the local nobility who are put in charge in some parts of the country of overseeing the process of survey do drag their feet. Now, this may be simply an unwillingness to be burdened with a process that is undoubtedly complex and time consuming. And I suspect with some local magnates, it is as simple as that. Perhaps there is an element among the local nobility also of reluctance to make known to central government exactly what their part in generating income from the church at ground level really is. Now, by the 16th century in England and Wales, the church isn't generating income in complete isolation. Church institutions appoint local nobility as their chief stewards, and they take a fee for that role as chief steward. A role really that is as much honorific as anything. A chief steward will, in a rather hands-off way, oversee the administration of a church institution, a monastery or a cathedral or a college, but they're not particularly hands-on, but they'll still take a fee for it. So I suspect that the nobility are beginning, even in the spring of 1535, to realize that this headship of the church could have implications for their own freedom of action in their own locality, and are perhaps a little bit less keen to see that happen. From the church's point of view, there's no particular ostensible reason to think that this is the first salvo in what is going to become a real battle with the crown. We have to remember that by 1535, church institutions across the country have been familiar with the crown making ad hoc interventions in the way that they manage their property, the way they manage their incomes. Some of the wealthier monasteries, for 15 years by this point, at least, had experienced approaches from the crown over particular properties. During Cardinal Thomas Wolsey's time as Henry's chief minister, he had put pressure on particular monasteries to engage in property swaps with the crown. They'd identified particular choice manors or whatever, which the crown thought would be rather good to have, and so had come to them saying, would you swap this for another property that's part of the crown estate? So that's part and parcel of these grand old institutions that have had property for centuries. They knew That's part of what it's like to live under a royal regime. And those things had happened even in earlier times, not just under Henry's father, but back into the 15th and 14th centuries. So the only significant novelty from the church's point of view is the sheer scale of this survey. And in fact, the church institutions take a part in carrying out the survey. So in some parts of the country, it is the heads of religious houses, the heads of monasteries, who are among those who are gathering the information. So it's quite a collaborative process. I think if we put to one side what we know happens subsequently, and we just look at what's happening in the spring and summer of 1535, we could say, well, this is a picture of what it's like to live under this new English church that is broken with Rome. That church institutions are working under the governance of the king together in many ways a sort of collaborative way. It's a brief image of what could have been the functionality of an English church under the king, broken with Rome, but in all other respects continuing to function much as it had done before.
And am I right in thinking many of them thought, well, actually, this is just a change in who is is at the top and who we pay our dues to, and actually, it might be quite good having the king of the country we're in being at the top as opposed to a foreign power.
Oh, absolutely. One of the greatest misconceptions that you'll still find in so many accounts of Tudor England, Henry's Reformation, the English Reformation more generally, is that somehow church institutions were slavishly loyal to the papacy and were horrified at the break with Rome. The complete reverse is true. There is no better way of putting it. Monasteries especially had no great love for the papacy. They never had. They saw the papacy, they would say, and I'm inclined to agree with them, they saw the medieval papacy for what it was, which is attempting to draw as much income from the different national churches across Christendom as they possibly could. And English monasteries resented enormously. Their whole self-image is of autonomy, independence, but pragmatically, if, as you put it, they have to be under some authority, they would rather be under the authority of the crown than of a prince of the church in Rome, as they would have put it. They mistrust the papacy for its desire for money. They mistrust it for its foreignness. For much of the late Middle Ages, they mistrust it for its Frenchness as well. There is a good old-fashioned English Francophobia that really ramps up that resentment of the papacy. The monastic establishment in England had shown a great interest in the course of the 100 Years' War, and I do think it stirs that sense of resentment of a papacy that, as they say, it has more or less been captured by the French, and we have through the 14th century a succession of these French popes. So no, there is a spirit, I think, across the church establishment in the spring of 1535 of willingness to see how this new dispensation is going to unfold. That they've recognized that the king's headship does draw a line in the sand. It is a new beginning for them and for England, but it's a new beginning that is not unwelcome. It gives them some of what they want. They've always believed that the crown is probably a better guarantor of the church's independence than any other authority. And so they are entering in, certainly, to this process of survey in a way with a will to see how this can work, with that one awareness that they know that Henry is going to be one of those monarchs who's going to be more interventionist than they've sometimes known. But that's tended to ebb and flow over the last 200 years in England. In 1535, they've known previous monarchs who've come knocking on the door saying, that manor of yours, will you swap it for one of mine? And so on. So they're accustomed to that. And in 1535, they've got no reason to think that Henry himself is committed to some theological reform, some fundamental change in the way that people worship and the way that they understand their faith. That is not on the horizon. This is a changing of the guard, if you like, but not necessarily an unwelcome one.
And the monasteries are massive landowners, which might be a surprise to people. They're not just their monastery or priory. They have land which has tenants. They might have land with tenants in different counties. They might be all over the country. I suppose this is over and above what the Domesday Book tells us, actually. What kind of information are they gathering when they're visiting these places?
They gather everything from the overview of what property these institutions own, right down to counting the number of sheep that they have grazing in their fields. So yes, it is far more than is captured in Domesday Book, but it is also covering, for every institution, it takes us on a journey across the country. So one of the striking things when you look at the survey, which comes as a surprise, I think, to anyone who may think, well, I know the medieval monastery that is in my locality and I've got a sense of where it was and so on. What you'll be surprised to find when you look at the Valor survey is that church, monastery, institution held property right across the country. So you start to see in the survey the long list of counties where they had pockets of property. I think the other feature is how diverse that portfolio of property was. These institutions held farmland, of course, but they hold property in other forms and in other locations too. It's striking how many of them are landlords in towns, landlords of residential property, landlords of shops, of market stalls. Quite a number of monasteries in the early 16th century, they're not running markets, but they actually own the permanent stall that traders come along and rent and trade from. And they're picking up a rent just from the stand or the stall itself. They are landlords of commercial properties and pick up rent from breweries, for example, and from inns and other commercial property that we might find in any 16th century town. Valor is especially useful as a snapshot because it's also one of the first moments that we capture how England's previously predominantly rural economy is beginning to shift and change too, because we find monasteries as landlords of the very first steps towards local industry. So a number of the monasteries in the West Midlands of England are found in Valor with a landlord interest in open cast coal mining. And we can begin to see that industry emerging. And there it is described in Valor. The survey not only captures the range of enterprises that the church is involved in, but it also records a good deal of information about the people. So we find, in many cases, in many of the entries, that the tenants of these properties are also named. One of the really striking features about Valor is it's a great indication for us, again, one of the few that we have in the early 16th century, where there are women who, in their own independent right, are acting as tenants of property. There we are, we see them named. We also get a good deal of information about how this property is being used, even the agricultural property. It's not simply described in a blanket way as farmland or meadow and grazing land. But the surveyors managed to gather information for most places that tells us a little bit about how they change their grazing patterns across the seasons or over a period of years, how they tend to sow the arable land, what are the main crops, what is the balance between a wheat crop and a barley crop and an oat crop. And again, often this information challenges what we might assume. I mean, we find, for example, that some monasteries land produces far more rye and barley than it does wheat, for example. So we are taken right down to ground level. And there are times where you really do have a sense that the surveyor you're almost following the surveyor as he walks the fields, gathering information on what is there.
Because it's sort of telling us the skills that were around as well, wasn't it? There was one, the Tarrant Abbey, Dorset, which was run by Cistercian nuns, 3,000 sheep. Now that's a level of husbandry that is established and probably quite admirable.
Yes, this is of a scale that probably we don't see again, actually, after the dissolution of the monasteries, because property holdings in rural England are progressively broken up. It's simply not feasible to maintain such large herds of livestock and to run them over connected swathes of land. Yet in 1535, we can see in southern and southwest England, because monasteries own contiguous parcels of land over a wide area, what the surveyors are finding is that they're able to maintain very, very substantial heads of cattle and sheep, but also to run them over these extraordinary areas. So Valor shows us how the Benedictine nuns at Wilton Abbey, for example, are running their sheep out of Wiltshire and into grazing land that they own in Somerset. For the summer, for their summer grazing, and then back again. What's nice about that, I think, as a historian, is that immediately conjures up quite a vivid image of what it was like to be in Henry VIII's England in 1535, because you didn't have to be connected with a monastery. You would have seen that happening, that movement of sheep. When the Wilton sheep went for their summer grazing, you couldn't miss it.
Must be summer.
Anyone who is the mark that summer was coming. Any of us who've driven down a country lane, occasionally we might find a small group of cows being moved across the lane after milking into their grazing field. But that's nothing by comparison with 3,000 head of sheep being moved across from one county to another. And I think that's why it's such a pity that historians have held back from the Valor survey, because once you're into it, here you have the raw data that can actually paint a picture of Tudor England in 3 dimensions. And although Henry VIII's England is better documented than earlier periods, of course it is, we still don't have very many moments when we can really begin to recover it in quite such vivid detail.
And right down to what the landscape was looking like, what the lowest levels of society were up to.
In our own day now, above all, we want an account of our past that has an awareness of that landscape and environment setting. We want to know how people lived in these places. We don't just want the bald record of events, but we want to know how they inhabited their world. And I think this survey is so valuable for that, because we do understand that these church institutions, these monasteries, were not just a church and a surrounding cloister and cluster of buildings, but they were a whole living organism in the landscape.
I want to get on to what it tells us about women, both in the monastic orders and their work and what we've lost. But first, I want to talk about why you think the Valor Ecclesiasticus has been overlooked. And I wanted specifically to talk about the story of Mr. Cayley, and then the assertion by Alexander Savine in 1909, who said, "Only a very patient reader will have the courage to wade through." And even for them, it would prove the dullest kind of historical research. And that sort of seemed to be adopted as okay, we'll leave that then. That sounds really dull.
The reason, I think, quite simply, that the Valor has been so badly neglected is that it's historians' fault. This is a sorry tale of what happens when historical research almost runs to the bad. So the Valor survey was held by the department of Henry's government that is created to manage the Crown's progressive capture of church property, and then as the dissolution begins, the sequestration of old closed monasteries' estates. That is the court of augmentations. So the Valor survey returns from all of the different parts of England are sort of gathered into the court of augmentations. The court of augmentations then is subsumed later in the Tudor period into the Royal Exchequer. So it becomes an Exchequer record. And there it sits. Of course, in many ways, it is overtaken by events. Henry commissioned it to understand what it was that he'd taken on, becoming head of the church. But by the end of Henry's reign, it's not got the direct relevance for running the English church that it would have had in the spring and summer of 1535. So to some extent, from a mid-Tudor perspective, it's a somewhat obsolete document, but it's preserved. At the beginning of the 19th century, when the government of George III is looking to do something about the principal public records that are held, Valor is among those that are identified as so important for the history of England and Wales that they should be published. And a royal commission is instituted by Parliament to take on the work of publishing principal records of the history of England and Wales, the history of the kingdom, and Valor is on the list to be published. The commission runs and produces publications based on those public records that are deemed to be the most important. But the publication of the Valor among those takes a very, very long period of time. The first volume appears in 1810, but it's nearly a quarter of a century before the final volume appears. The publication is put in charge of a man called John Cayley, who is keeper of the public records. Now, as some people will know, before there was a National Archives at Kew, the Public Record Office was established in Chancery Lane in Holborn in central London. And there was a keeper of the public records. And in the early 19th century, it's a man called Cayley. Now, Cayley outwardly was a respectable antiquarian and scholar like there were many of in the early 19th century in England. He's a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, which is the foremost society for scholars at that time. So highly respected, highly renowned, which is why he's given the job of overlooking the publication of these records. That's his outward figure, but those who have to work with him know him to be a very different kind of character. Above all, Cayley, although he is handsomely paid for this work of publishing major records of England's history, he actually has what today we'd call, I suppose, a side hustle, which is he chooses documents in the public records that he thinks he might be able to get a good price for on the open market. And he takes them home with him and he sells them just to supplement his income. Meanwhile, he seems to bully the young team of scholars who are engaged to actually do the work of transcribing this Tudor document and turning it into a printable record. And there's quite a revolving door of staff who decide, I can't work with this terrifying figure anymore, which is one reason the whole thing takes such a long time to publish. Meanwhile, Cayley is continuing to filch documents, spirit them away. He's also not doing what he should be doing, which is actually supervising how well put together the printed, published version is going to be. So he overlooks some copies of the Valor survey. So the whole thing is emerging as a rather kind of thrown together edition. By the beginning of the 1830s, so 20 years after the project was initiated and the first volume appeared, it's clearly an open secret that the whole thing is a mess and that Cayley is crooked. But nobody dare do anything about it. Finally, the House of Commons, who initiated the whole Royal Commission for Public Records, has had enough. And as far as I'm aware, for the first and only time in Britain's history, a House of Commons inquiry, which as we know today is a big deal, a House of Commons inquiry is initiated for a research project, a historical research project. They are so alarmed at the rumours surrounding all of the mismanagement and criminality that has taken place here that they initiate an inquiry. The inquiry doesn't deliver its verdict, though, until after, in many ways, fortunately, the appalling Mr. Cayley has died. And at that point, everything comes out of the woodwork, out of the shadows. And these young scholars who he had been bullying come forward and say that what a terrible time they've had working on this badly managed project. Of course, as you'd expect at this point, and we've seen it with other public inquiries, everybody who is brought before the Commons as a witness blames Cayley, which is the sensible thing to do because the man is dead. And as a public inquiry, effectively, it's wrapped up with the general view that Cayley was a complete monster and messed it up, but there is a sort of closure because he's dead. Finally, all of the intended 6 volumes gathering together a printed version of the Valor Valuation Survey, Henry VIII's Domesday, appear by 1834. But it's almost as if the suspicion and scandal surrounding it is such that it effectively buries the publication at the very moment that it appears. And it's hardly referred to, hardly used, and it's never reprinted. And by the end of the 19th century, it's become a bit of a white elephant in historical research circles. And I think it's a reflection of how its status is so damaged that it takes this Russian emigre, escapee from the Russian Revolution, Professor Alexander Savine, who is living in exile in Edwardian London, to take it up again and try and do something with it. Produces a study of it, which for its day is an extraordinarily sophisticated piece of work. But the comment you've quoted from Savine, who says, in effect, it would take a brave soul to go anywhere near this thing, is really heartfelt, because these 6 volumes that Cayley so badly mishandled in producing are a very, very forbidding set of volumes to use. The decision had been taken by the Royal Commission when they were printing documents to print them in what was then known as record type. That is a typeface that reproduced the abbreviated letters and abbreviated words and symbols connected with letters that were used in the original 16th century script. Now, to reproduce those in type is not very easy, certainly wasn't very easy in the 19th century. So you do tend to get a rather blurry print on the paper of something that, at any rate, is not legible unless you know what those symbols mean. It would be a little bit like printing a novel, but printing it in shorthand. There would be a relatively small number of people who could pick up that novel and read it straight off. And that's effectively what they did, which is why even this pioneering Russian emigre economic historian finds it a pretty forbidding piece of work to read. Printing any medieval or early 16th century record in record type, if you want to make something accessible, you failed at the first step by deciding to print it in record type. So they printed in Latin, in record type. It's illegible to the vast majority of people, including historians. A great many historians struggle to read the record. And that's why, after Savine, sadly, I really feel for this guy who's escaped the Russian Revolution. He's there in London, pioneer economic historian. Then he's carried off by, I think it's TB, fairly soon after he's embarked on his great project. So I'm sure if Savine had lived into the later 20s and 30s, we might have seen more great work on this record and other early Tudor records. But sadly, it's not to be. And historians across the 20th century steer clear. It's a difficult document to read. I think it's also true to say Valor has suffered because, as I've said, Henry VIII's government is an ambitious, if you like, early modern government, but working with medieval machinery. The condition of the Valor document reflects that medieval machinery. It's written in Latin, it's written in highly abbreviated Latin on sheets of badly stitched together parchment. A lot of Tudor historians are trained as Tudor historians. They're not trained as medieval scholars. They're not accustomed to reading densely abbreviated Latin. And I think the rigid separation between the medieval and the early modern in the way that historians are trained hasn't helped access to this record, because the researchers who are trained to read documents of those kinds tend to end their research when they get to about 1500. And the researchers who are trained to study Henry VIII's reign don't get the training in the language and in the habit of abbreviation that belongs in the Middle Ages, if you like. So it's sort of falling on the cusp between two periods. And then we have this appallingly bad edition from the early 19th century that doesn't help us anyway, which has become, it's an incredibly difficult book, or 6 volumes, to get hold of today, precisely because it's been so little used. Sadly, a lot of public libraries that were issued with these Royal Commission on Public Records volumes discarded them because they weren't being used. So it's such a sorry story. When you compare it to something like Domesday Book, which is printed and then there are modern 20th century editions, and you'll find it in so many different public libraries, local studies libraries, and so on. It's something that has reached a wider readership very, very well for a century record. But this 16th century equivalent, not at all.
Did the sheets that got sold off, were they ever recovered? Or have we lost them?
Some pieces of some Valor survey returns, so those are the returns made from different regions of the country as part of the survey, have turned up in private collections. So lots of private individuals who collect antiquarian books and documents and manuscripts across the country have picked up Tudor era documents through auction sales and so on. And in the last few years, I have identified pieces that are either original returns or copies of original returns, but were made soon after, that have come up in private collections of documents that have been sold off after the original collector has died. It's certainly encouraged me to think that if these have turned up in the last 5 years or so, there are probably more out there to be found. When these items turn up, I always feel it's something of a mad scramble to get sight of them before they disappear again, because these are Tudor documents being bought and sold in commercial sale rooms by auctioneers. Auctioneers are generally very, very cooperative and supportive of researchers and will allow you access for the period between when they publish their catalogue and when the sale takes place. But that is only ever a fixed period of time. So off I go to an auction sale room with my laptop and try and transcribe as much as I can before the document is sold again, because the nature of that auction sale world is such that once a document has been sold, it will disappear into a private collection, and it might be another 100 years before we know of it again. Not every private collector is prepared to allow a researcher to see any part of their collection, and so you may never know if you haven't had that chance to examine it while it's on sale. You may never have the chance to see it again. Organisations like British Library down to individual researchers, those of us who are committed to documenting this period are keeping a watchful eye all the time for what turns up. But the story of the Valor is not unique in that respect. If anyone cares to look at something like eBay, you will see that documents of British history are out there being traded all the time, and it's a constant chase, really, to catch hold of them and to see whether they can fill in some of the gaps that we have.
Because we also don't know what we haven't got, I suppose. That we know there's gaps, but what is filling those gaps, we wouldn't know unless we saw it.
No, I mean, one of the interesting things about the fragments that have come up from the Valor is that it does point to the circulation of different drafts of the survey. So one of the fragments that I viewed that had come up for auction carried different values of property and different values in some instances for whole monasteries to those that ended up in the final version.
Mm. Oh, so it indicates there were potentially multiple versions of it as well.
Yes, wow. Absolutely.
Wow. Okay, could carry on talking about that, but I want to talk to you about women and what the Valor Ecclesiasticus and what the whole dissolution really tells us about women's role before and after the full-scale dissolution. Religious institutions, that was actually a mechanism, a route for women to not have to go down the route of marriage and the dangers of childbirth. It was a way of them gaining, I'm not saying this is why they did it, but rank and respectability in society. And we're often told that history is written down by men, and because of the type of men who were literate, i.e. mainly the men in monasteries and things, that there was an air of maybe misogyny about it, just because they're not really dealing with women in their day to day, and that's the history that's come down to us. But there seems to be indication that actually women were writing down history. They were, but a lot of that hasn't come down to us. Maybe we could start with the fact that women, there was no real route after the Reformation for women to have anything like the positions in the church that maybe were afforded to men, and then how that's impacted on what has actually come down to us from what they were doing, and they're impacting on our understanding of what women were doing.
Yeah, so what the Reformation brings to an end, quite simply, is women in the church among the clergy. I think we shouldn't allow the fact that, of course, women were never priests to mask the fact that women were there before the Reformation in the body of the clergy. And the head of a religious house of women, an abbess, a prioress, was accorded the same status as their male equivalent, and they were among the prelates, the senior figures of the church. And from a woman's perspective, what had been a community of the church in the Middle Ages of men and women becomes a purely masculine church at the Reformation. So they are simply taken out of the personnel of the church. And I think historians do not often enough place emphasis on that point, that when people before the Reformation thought about the church as an institution made up of people, they thought of both men and women. And they didn't simply think, well, there are priests and archbishops and bishops and so on. They understood that there was a population of both men and women, and that entirely comes to an end. And in those parts of Europe that are reformed and following some or other form of Protestant religion, there is no place for women. There isn't a substitute or an alternative. There is no place for women. Women no longer govern any church institutions. And again, we don't place sufficient emphasis, I think, on what came with the position of abbess or prioress. They are governing a church. They manage its property. They preside over all of its sources of income. They represent it in interaction with other church institutions. So, and across the hierarchy of the church. If the papacy, the archbishop, the bishop wishes to deal with a religious house of women, they deal with its principal, who is a woman. And in the medieval church, male clergy were familiar with interacting with both male and female colleagues, which is why it is such an opportunity, and of course such a significant opportunity cost at the Reformation, that women had been part of the church hierarchy. They lose that opportunity. As part of the church hierarchy, they had had a taste of lordship, presiding over grace estates. They had a presence in legal business, in financial and fiscal business. A good many religious houses for women are located in urban locations, and as a consequence, the heads of those houses, the women who led them, often found themselves dealing in urban government, interacting with the governing councils and so on that lead these cities. So women's public presence is very evident through their place in the church. And there is no escaping the fact that the end of these institutions narrows their public presence, and in some locations removes it entirely, where in some cities in Europe, the abbess or prioress of a great house planted in that city would have been a public figure in that city. They've gone. It's all gone. And there is no equivalent. Women are no longer dealing with those presiding over the city council. They're no longer dealing with landed estates in this way. And there is simply no new opportunity that comes close to this. I think in religious culture too, for most worshippers in the pre-Reformation world, you would have experienced some aspect of religious worship that involved both men and women. A lot of female religious houses share church space with a parish. And so if you went to your parish church, you might well be familiar with the fact that in the gallery at one end comes the worship of the women, exclusively female voices, part of that really rich mix of sounds and spectacle that you would get in the pre-Reformation church. Again, that's gone. There's no female choir in post-Reformation religious worship. So many of those elements that were part and parcel, entirely familiar, entirely conventional in pre-Reformation experience, are made masculine by the Reformation. I think we struggle a bit, I think, with a sort of knee-jerk view of the medieval nun as somehow inherently subordinate, and our immediate thought perhaps is she's not there by her own will, she's been pushed there by a family, by a parent, and we assume that the nunnery itself is subordinate to external male authority, and all nunneries are poor, most nunneries are in some backwater anyway where nobody noticed them. And historians have contributed to some extent to that view, but most of those assertions are just not accurate. Nunneries are wealthy. Often there are fewer nunneries in medieval England than there are male monastic institutions, but some of those nunneries are fabulously well off with property and income. Their locations are not all backwaters. Actually, it is a misconception. A lot of these female religious houses are closer to a surrounding neighborhood than male houses, and much more directly involved, not least because their churches are often shared, and so therefore something of a hub for the religious culture of the surrounding area. So I think there's a case to be made, certainly across the whole of Europe, there's a case to be made that monastic women are more seen and understood and interacted with at street level often than their male counterparts. We know now also, even where in those parts of medieval Europe where nuns are subject to strict enclosure, so effectively they are locked in, that nonetheless a remarkable amount of interaction with wider society was possible and was experienced, and family and friends and the local neighborhood visit and interact with these women, notwithstanding the grill that was supposed to remain between them. It's also clear that a lot of the rhetoric from the male church hierarchy around enclosing monastic women didn't translate into enforcing it in practice. I must admit, the more I read about medieval religious experience, the more I feel it is an experience that is quite evenly balanced between male and female voices, male and female ways of performing the acts of worship, male and female experiences too. Perhaps predictably, what you might expect from the male clergy are clever and often quite compelling sermons presented from the pulpit. What medieval Christians get from their female clergy are mystical experiences, stories of visions, stories of almost the supernatural in religion. And they are the main channels for a lot of those experiences. And they're very popular. Dante in the Divine Comedy references this monastic woman who's become legendary in Florence for her visions of Christ. What was so striking about the female presence in medieval religion was that it was almost the sort of perfect counterpart to what believers got from male clergy. They fit together in a way by the late Middle Ages that is forming a really very rich and sort of multifaceted experience of what it was to be religious. When we write about what's lost at the Reformation, too often we focus on closure of buildings, institutions, churches being broken up, beautiful objects being broken up. It's high time that we refocused what is lost in that female experience. Where can that female experience go? It has nowhere to go in the public sphere. I think that's what's striking. Protestant practice pushes it entirely back into the private sphere. Women can be pious, they can be channels of spirituality in the reformed world, but in the household, and in households that are, of course, patriarchal. So in many ways, it's a regressive transition. There is nothing really comparable to almost at times the sort of free form experience that was possible for women living in a religious house in the Middle Ages after the Reformation. They may have their prayer book in their Reformed Protestant household, but it's a household governed by a husband or a father or a brother, a man of some kind, not a household governed by a woman. And although communities of women survive in some parts of Reformed Reformation Europe, in Germany, for example, we see these Damenstift or households of women. They are used by the Protestant patriarchy as a way, they take, if you like, the monastic principle that women had previously lived together in a sort of convent setting, but effectively to reinforce this male takeover of women's culture by using these as a way of sort of containing women until they're ready for marriage. So it's not really a survival of any kind of autonomy that they had known before the Reformation.
Monasteries are famous for being the book producers, and we have chronicles that tell us about our history. Would those kind of things also being produced in female institutions?
Yes. So what we lose is not just the experience of a great deal of autonomy, in some ways, equal footing in this medieval church, but we lose the environment in which women could express themselves in many different cultural forms, in writing, in artwork. And from a historian's point of view, we simply don't know how much of that we have lost. Of course, we lose a good many books, original writing, original artwork from all church institutions that are closed at the Reformation, those inhabited by men and women. But because of the nature of the cultural activity in communities of men, a proportion of their work is saved because it has some place in the Reformed world. Communities of church men had produced works in the Latin language of education, and they had produced predominantly educational material. And that material finds a place, some of it, in the schools and universities of the post-Reformation world. They'd also produced histories which are regarded as contributing to a sort of national narrative of history, and some of those are very consciously saved. Of course, the men in those institutions also have a life after the Reformation, many of them, as clergy in the Reformed Church, and they carry their books with them. And that's another reason why some of them survive. But in the female communities, there is a fundamental and absolute discontinuity. Those women have nowhere to go. They don't have a post-Reformation life. They go back into the family and into family households. They cannot live as female clergy in a Reformed world. They do not carry their books and other artifacts with them in the same way that men do. And there's no place for their books of worship in the Reformed Church. There's no reason to see them saved. So we see a good deal of material just being lost. There is a real disparity between what is lost from the British Isles and what is lost in mainland Europe. So in recent years, really good research has been done to recover some of the original writing from monastic women living in mainland Europe. And it gives us an indication of the kind of material that probably existed from their counterparts in England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, which has simply been lost. So from the Netherlands, from Germany, we find chronicle accounts written by women about their convents in the 14th and 15th centuries. They're often referred to as sister books because they record the lives of the sisters over different generations. Now, it's quite possible that something akin to those sister books did exist in British female communities, but for the reasons I've given, they simply weren't saved. I think perhaps particularly tantalizing, perhaps the greatest loss, the area that we know least about and we, of course, would love to know more about, though, is the female contribution to material culture, that women's communities would have been producing as much original artwork as their male counterparts. And given that so few sites of female monasteries were preserved for church use, a good deal of the panel paintings, statuary, glass, and so on that would have filled them has simply gone. Of course, the textiles, church vestments, and so on that women may have contributed to have gone. So we probably must account for a significant, if you like, multimedia contribution of monastic women, which has left almost no record. And again, I think we have to, this is where comparative history is really important. We can look across to Europe and see examples from really quite surprising locations. There's some wonderful, rich textiles produced by nuns in pre-Reformation Iceland, for example, which are an indication of the sort of quality of material I'm sure British monastic women were producing. It just doesn't survive. We can point to manuscript painting done by Italian monastic women in the 15th and early 16th centuries, which I'm sure is just a glimpse of what their British sisters almost certainly produced, but has not been preserved. So There's an argument, I think, after what 150 years of professional history, really focusing on this process of Reformation and its impact, but essentially telling a male story, that we put that to one side and re-emphasize this narrative of the huge loss of a medieval cultural and religious experience in which both sexes made distinctive contributions, to one where the distinctive contribution of one sex is almost completely erased. And in many respects, given contemporary values, that's a far more important story than ruined arches and the loss of a centuries-old tradition of monasticism. That fundamental change in the cultural space occupied by women at the Reformation is perhaps one of its most important stories.
James, I mentioned in the introduction how the fact that it was going to be a full-scale dissolution was not really in evidence until it was actually what had happened. And one of the possibly best indicators of this is just how many men and women were still joining these institutions.
Yes, the big mistake that we all make when we think about Henry VIII's Reformation is that we assume that he and his subjects knew what was coming next. Of course, they didn't. And it's very striking that even after Henry makes himself head of the church, supreme governor, at the end of 1534, even after he's then sent out his commissioners to make a valuation survey of the church and conduct a visitation of all church institutions, even, in fact, after small, poor, what he deems not viable monasteries are beginning to be shut down in 1536, men and women still come forward to join monasteries. I wanted to test what in my early researches for the book had been just a hunch, that I'd come across a surprising number of men and women still described as novices in the records of the dissolution, when the Crown Commissioners showed up finally to shut down a monastery. I'd been struck by the number of instances where, when they listed the members of the community, they'd identified a number of novices. Because what that told me, generally speaking, you're only a novice for about a year, and sometimes for a shorter period than that. So if people were novices when their monastery was finally closed, they could not have been there very long. And I was really curious to test what was beginning to build as a hunch. Hold on a minute. This does suggest that in spite of all that's happened, even as late as the end of 1536, clearly people were still coming to join, and that they were not reading the pattern of events as necessarily tending towards one predetermined end. In other words, the end of this whole institution of monasticism. So I turned to the registers of ordinations across the country, because typically in male monastic communities, monasteries and friaries, young men who have entered the community are sent to their bishop to be ordained as part and parcel of their process of getting through their novitiate, their training period. So knowing when they're ordained is a good sort of proxy indicator for how many people are entering a monastery at any one time. And what I found was that young men are still coming forward to be ordained, and so therefore have almost certainly only just arrived at the monastery, right the way through until as late as September 1539, when we're only, about 7 or 8 months from the final monasteries being shut down, just around about Easter 1540. So very, very late on, we might think. Another indicator of novices still present in a monastery just at the point that it is being closed down is actually in the sums of money allocated to monks and nuns as their pension when the monastery is closed by the crown. Because pensions were graduated according to how long you'd been in a monastery. Just like most people's pensions today, your pension is worth more if your term of service with your employer is very long. If you've been employed for 40 years, you'll get more pension than if you've been there for 4 years. The same is true with the pensions handed out at the dissolution. Certain sums of money were used by the commissioners clearly as the sums most appropriate to be given to a novice. So it became clear to me that a sum that is very, very modest, like 40 shillings, which is £2 in old money, 20 shillings to a pound. 40 shillings was typically allocated to those who'd only just either were still novices or had only just finished their novitiate. And I was struck again by the number of men and women who were being assigned these low sums in pensions. So taken together, it shows, yes, that in 1536, 1537, 1538, people are still coming forward to join monasteries and friaries. Now, the cynical view, to try and shoot the argument down, might be, hold on a minute, they know the end is coming, they're showing up to a monastery wanting to join simply because they know if they do so, they'll get money. But as I've said, the money that is allocated to a novice is very small and is certainly not something that you can live off for the rest of your life. So actually, the financial incentive to join a monastery as late as 1538, even after other monasteries have been shut down, is so small, it seems highly unlikely to me that that's the main motivation. I think rather it is a demonstration that through the later 1530s, inside the monasteries and out there in the neighbourhoods, people understood there were going to be fewer monasteries in this new church governed by the king, but they didn't understand that there were going to be no monasteries until the spring of 1540, when there were no monasteries.
Wonderful. Well, James, honestly, I could talk to you about all of this all day, and I'm sure people would listen as well. So I will point them in the direction of your book once again, The Dissolution of the Monasteries, A New History. Where else? I've got some Patreon questions, so I'm not going to let you go just yet. But before we finish the main part of the interview and say goodbye to most people, where can people find you online, find your work as well?
So you can find me online in a new documentary that is produced by History Hit called The Dissolution of the Monasteries, a 2-hour documentary. And for those of you who are interested in this history, I'd recommend it not least because of the really panoramic shots, actually, of some favourite monastic sites. If you know your Fountains Abbey and your Glastonbury, you will find me at Gloucester History Festival, which is running in the autumn. My new book is coming out next year with Alan Lane Penguin, and that is simply called Monasterium. So I hope a memorable title. So, like my colleague Tom Holland, I know he likes his, Dominion and so on titles. So I'm catching up with Tom with Dominion. You'll also find I've been leading over this summer a project with National Trust, bringing some of the lost music of England's monasteries back to life. And you will find online, including under my Twitter handle, which is James G. Clark, you will find part of the music that we've brought back. This is the sound that Henry VIII silenced. So it is definitely worth listening to. This is some music found in fragments of manuscripts, and we've performed it once again.
Wonderful. I should also point out that we have a series that we recorded a couple of years ago on YouTube and my podcast. I'll link to that people can go and see. And also that if you're a member of my Patreon, patreon.com/British History, there are a couple more talks from James in there. And it's patrons who've been able to ask their own questions for James, which we'll get onto in a moment. But for everyone else, thank you for joining us. And thank you, James.
Thank you very much. Modern media, perhaps especially, has turned Henry VIII into Stalin, but he's not Stalin. He's not a dictator of such terrifying savagery that his subjects are cowed into compliance at all. The monasteries especially are really very interested in the proposition of a state church. If they're going to have to be governed, they would rather do it with the crown than with a foreign pope.
Do you think Henry VIII ever had any remorse for dissolving the abbeys?